the far north. A storied place of daring exploration and untamed wilderness. But the high Arctic is also a place of rapid change.
The temperature in the Arctic is rising at a faster rate than the rest of the world.
Up here we see the changes most. The glacier fronts are literally disappearing in front of our eyes here. It goes very fast.
These changes are taking place at a time when modern science doesn't have a full understanding of how Arctic ecosystems work during all times of the year.
The polar night, that's defined as the period when the sun is below the horizon 24 hours a day. The length of the polar night varies according to latitudes. At the pole, it lasts for 185 days. So at the pole, there's only one night and one day. At the Arctic Circle, it lasts for one day, and then there's everything in between.
It's basically dark 24/7. And so that has a huge impact on the fjord ecosystem. If there's no light, then there's no primary production.
There are algae in the ocean that are phytoplankton that photosynthesize to create energy, and all other organisms are reliant on that energy.
During the polar night, when the base of the food web is basically cut out, for decades, it was just kind of assumed that everything else stops. There's no food.
So this period, when it's dark, had remained completely unsampled, unstudied for many, many years.
Targeted research into polar night ecology didn't begin until 2009, after an accidental discovery made scientists realize this wasn't a dormant period in the ocean after all.
It came as a massive surprise.
And the more you look into it, the more you find that there's actually high activity during the polar night.
It's an important piece of the overall ecology of the ecosystem to understand, to tie it in with what's going on in the summer.
Looking at the seasonal patterns in the polar regions is a huge knowledge gap. So filling that in is important for that very base level fundamental understanding of how does the Earth work. And then the second layer is that the Arctic is very rapidly changing. We have warming water, receding sea ice, melting glaciers, things like that happening. So understanding the consequences of that change is a major question for the scientific community right now.
What tiny animals are active in the ocean during the polar night? And how are they able to survive without their main food source?